Okay, everybody, welcome to the Combat Zone. I'm Nick. He's Joseph. I'm here. He's not. Actually, he is in Vienna, Austria, my co-host, Joseph, and he's joining us this evening. What's the time difference, Joseph?
It's 6 hours, Nick, so all's good. All's 100% good. It's just 3 a.m. here in Vienna, where I'm calling in from. So, just a perfect time to get up. Listen, I got to tell you, it's hot here, and there's no air conditioning where I am. And in fact, it's surprising that there is so little air conditioning. Now, the big hotel chains and stuff like that have air conditioning, and I'm not suggesting that they don't have air conditioning in Europe. Of course they do, but we're not in a hotel. I'm attending a conference, and the facility that I'm in has, rooms with showers, etc. And it's very clean, very modern, but no air conditioning. And so we're hitting temperatures of 34, 35 degrees Celsius every day. And there's very little air circulation in these rooms. So you can imagine that they get very hot and stuffy. And I had the windows open, but I closed them because I don't want to disturb the people sleeping in the next room to me by having my windows wide open and doing the combat zone. So there it is. But I'm not, of course, as you know, Nick, I'm not going to divulge the exact location of Studio Europe.
No, I wouldn't do that either, because we don't want people to know where Studio B is, for that matter. I wanted to ask you, there is something you could do. Do they have ice machines over there?
Well, they must, because I can order a drink with ice, but I actually haven't seen an ice machine around here like what you would get at a standard hotel anywhere in the world, frankly.
You know what I was going to suggest?
I don't know, ice. Get a handful of ice and put it in a towel or whatever, and lie in bed with it on top of my head.
Fill the bathtub with ice and leave the bathroom door open. Hey,
there's no bathtub, Nick.
What?
It's a shower. No, it's just a shower stall.
Oh man, the luxury. Even out in the country, we got a bath. We had bathtubs before we had showers.
I know. Well, I could take a cold shower anytime I want.
Yeah, fair enough.
Will tell you, the shower in the room where I'm in is quite spectacular. I love showers, and I very rarely take baths. And
as much fun as I'm having with this, I think I've taken, and now I shower frequently too. Don't anybody get the wrong idea, but I've taken about 2 baths in the last 10 years, but I thoroughly enjoyed them both.
Yeah.
I don't know why I don't take more.
This is. I think we're taking free association here to an absurd level.
Yeah, probably we should. Let's get back to the topics at hand. I posted on my Facebook page what the topics are, so let me just bring them up. The first one that I thought we'd dive into is there's been a couple stories out of one out of Ontario, one out of BC about medically assisted dying. In the case out of London, in the Victoria Hospital here in Ontario, there's a 42-year-old man had a nervous disorder, and it was chronic. In other words, there was no cure. Now, he didn't want to die. He had no intention of ending his life. All he wanted was some home care. Now, I won't go into the gory details of the story, but he didn't get it. What he did get was a long string of solid and not solid but persistent suggestions that taking the short route out, in other words, taking a doctor assisted or medically assisted dying, would be the best option for him. And he said he didn't want that. And anyway, in a nutshell, that's what happened there. In the case out of BC, there was a young man who had a closed head injury. Now, in my own personal life, I have a family member who is dealing with a closed head injury. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that when someone has a serious brain injury, they are not able to manage their own affairs, not from a legal point of view. And now I know not every injury is the same, not everyone is as serious, but let's just use my family member as an example. That person would not be in any condition to be able to decide for themselves, even if I thought it was a reasonable choice, which I don't. I'm pardon the sick pun, but I'm dead set against it. Would not be able to make that decision in any kind of lucid manner. There's just too much damage to the brain to be able to think straight. So at least in the case of my family member, it would be a horrid situation. So this teenager, a nephew of the person in the story, asked to have medically assisted dying, and the medical staff said, no, you can't have it because you don't have any chronic illness, you don't have any scenario that would make your life unbearable, you don't qualify. He got a hold of one of these lobbyist groups, and they went to bat for him, and 3 days later he was dead. So there's all kinds of problems with this. Now, on top of all that, for me, the problem here, those are bad enough. And I'm not trying to say, and I'll let you in on this conversation here in just a second, but because there was quite a conversation going back and forth on Facebook about this, there was a story about a killer whale who was in trouble, and marine biologists were trying to save it. And that was news all across the country. Now, I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't try to save the killer whale, but the amount of attention that story got, far outweighed anything about a real, human tragedy going on right under our noses. And that's the part that's disordered in my mind. It's not that I don't care about animals. It's not that I don't care about, being compassionate towards, let's call them lesser creatures, because they're not humans. But to me, humans come first. So while the two systems don't actually line up, you're not talking about a medical system, doctors taking time off the hospital, go down and try to save a whale when they've got people in the hospital who need them. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying that people's attention seems to be drawn more to be compassionate towards an animal than they are to their own kind.
Well, first of all, Nick, let me say something that I know that you're not going to say because of the kind of person you are, but listeners should know that when Nick is referring to a family member, Nick and his wife have been looking after in their own home out on a farm this family member for many, many years, instead of just putting her in an institution or ignoring her or whatever. So, it's a wonderful example of Nick of how families care for one another, and they look after one another. And I'm not trying to put other people on the spot, and I certainly don't want to put you on the spot. But I wanted to emphasize, Nick, that on this particular issue, from firsthand experience what you're talking about. So I just think that it's important that people really appreciate, the depth of your knowledge on this particular subject and related subjects. And on the point that you're making, I think it's a very excellent point. It's, the raising of animals to the standard or the status of human beings, or probably more precise, the lowering of the status of human beings in our society to the status of mere animals, to the point where compassion, there's no real difference anymore in how we treat animals and human beings, in Canada anyway, with respect to compassion. So in other words, if a human being, if our fellow human being is suffering, rather than finding ways to help them to cope with their suffering, which is, part of the human condition, Nick. You and I have talked about this many times before. Yep. People suffer. It's part of being human. So when people suffer now, of course, the tendency is to say we want to alleviate that suffering, not by caring for them, not by, helping them cope with their pain, making them comfortable, propping them up emotionally. No, what we want to do now is we want to just help them end their lives. And I'm going to take you to task on one point here, Nick. It's not physician-assisted dying. That's a bit of a euphemism that was invented because, the word euthanasia polled poorly when it was market tested, and therefore proponents of euthanasia, or, let's be even more precise in what we're talking about. We're talking about murdering human beings. None of these things poll very well, so they came up with this term physician-assisted dying because it was the only way that they could describe it in a manner that didn't evoke negative and in some cases extremely negative reactions. So, yeah, it's a terrible situation, and I think back to 20 years ago when people like we, I should say, let's be grammatically correct. People like we were arguing about the slippery slope, and it sounds like a simplistic argument, a simplistic, almost naive concern. But I recall and still get the same thing. The slippery slope argument is not really a valid argument, and everybody's always worried about the slippery slope. Well, all you have to do is look retrospectively. 20 years ago, the kinds of things that are normal now that we're debating would not have been acceptable even to have a discussion around 20 years ago or 25 or 30 years ago. So the slippery slope argument is not a warning for the future. It's an observation of how things have progressed over the last couple of decades in Canada in particular, but in many other countries around the world. But Canada, I'm going to say this, and then I'll let you get back into the conversation, Nick. And I've now been here on this side of the Atlantic for a week and a half. Spent a few days in Germany. I spent one night in Czechoslovakia and a couple of nights, a weekend actually, in Poland before coming over to Austria for this conference in Vienna. And I don't know that Canadians really appreciate how far ahead of the curve they are on many of these issues. It's when I talk about some of the things going on in our country, in Canada, to Europeans who are used to and fancy themselves as being, the most progressive people on the planet. In many cases, they're shocked, like literally shocked at some of the things that they hear that we're doing in Canada. And there are a number of examples that we've talked about, Nick, about that we might be able to get into discussing on the show tonight. But it's pretty bad.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the kind words earlier. Just for an update, we've kind of reached the end of what we can do for my family member. So we have found suitable accommodations in a facility that is very close to another family member who will, be there on a daily basis to make sure she's properly looked after. But it just got to a point where there was nothing more that we could do. And after over 20 years, watching this slow decline take place, it was just time for us. We just knew that our capacity to keep her safe, keep the family members safe, and to keep the everybody else in the house safe at the same time had reached its end. So just so that people understand that, you can do a tremendous amount, but sometimes you have to be a little self-critical and lay emotion aside and do what's in the best interest of the individual. This is not one of those cases with this.
Right, and that's what I was going to say, is that the answer, surely to goodness, when you're talking about human beings, is not to put them to death, even if they themselves desire it.
Yeah.
At some point in time, you have to, as a society, you have to draw a line. And the whole euthanasia argument, as is the case in many public policy areas, is, we talk about being compassionate, and we talk about being flexible, and we talk about rights, etc. But really, at the very fundamental part of all of these arguments is the argument that there shouldn't be a line that we should not cross. So every time you talk about a line, the progressives in our society they mobilize with the objective of obliterating those lines of behavior.
If I could,
and at some point in time, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I could use a sports analogy, imagine trying to play the game of football, and not only do you not have goalposts, but you don't have sidelines or end zones either. After a little while, the game becomes so nebulous that either everything goes or nothing will work. Because, again, I'm using a very simplified example, but if you take away all the rules and regulations and the boundaries, if you will, surrounding that activity, before long it doesn't even look close to what the game was supposed to look like. Now, life in some senses is a game, but this is not the kind of game where this is serious business. We're talking about people's life and death here. So, to come back to a more serious tone on it, that's in effect what we've done here. We've just peeled away all the regulations that guard human life and transmit the sanctity of life, that we're not animals, that we, some people say, well, we're just a higher form of animal. I've never believed that. I don't believe that for a second. I think there's something intrinsically valuable about human beings that isn't true of any other animal on the planet. So that's kind of where I come from.
I think it was G.K. Chesterton that pointed out, and I'm paraphrasing completely on this, but in reference to the American Declaration of Independence making reference to the fact that human beings were created equal. In other words, we didn't evolve equally; we were created equal. And his observation was that the American Declaration of Independence was absolutely correct to establish the principle of equality on the doctrine or the principle or the philosophical premise that human beings are created beings. And the reason was he was very succinct. He said, because if we weren't created equally, then the evidence all around us is that we evolved unequally. So there is no argument, there is no philosophical justification for equality except in the doctrine of creation. And now, I know that there are people out there, and maybe even most people out there, are going to reject that observation, and it's their right to do so, but you can't just ignore some of these important philosophical premises with impunity. The fact is that there is no scientific proof that certain things with respect to behavior are for human beings and standards of behavior for our societies and individually are scientifically proven. And there's a limit to science and what science has to say on some of these issues. I know that, again, there are people who are going to hear that and they're going to go, they're not scientific, et cetera. But, science can't tell you what's right and wrong. Science can't say that human beings, that life is sacred and that human beings occupy a space well above the space that other animals occupy. And as a consequence, we should be treating human life very differently than we would treat the life of a dog or a horse. And I know you guys are into horses on your farm, and if a horse falls and breaks its leg, Nick, as you very well know, you're not going to put the horse in a cast and he's going to walk around with crutches for 3 months, right? So you end up killing the horse. That may be compassionate when it comes to
an animal. But
an animal, but not with human beings.
Let me just give my 2 cents, because we're kind of flirting with this idea of creationism versus evolution. My attitude about that is, first of all, how it all happened, I don't know, and I don't waste a lot of time dwelling on the issue. I hear the argument Chesterton is making, and I agree with it. To me, when it comes to the difference between... the way I heard a priest put it one time, he said, I'll admit to the Big Bang as long as you admit that God lit the fuse. And I'm perfectly fine with that. Like, we don't know how long evolution took. We don't know if it was a 6-day creation or 6 billion years. What role did evolution play? I don't know. And I don't think that for daily life, it really matters that much. It does. This idea of the creationist theology, which is what you're pointing out, that G.K. Chesterton, is more, for me at least, a philosophical discussion rather than a physical one. Because at some point, even if man did evolve from lower animals, however you want to look at it, at some point there's a break. And that break is when we became fully human. And if you want to call that creation, fine, I can live with that. I don't have a problem with that. But at the same time, I'm not willing to suggest to say that, well, no, evolution couldn't possibly work. So that's the way I've always looked at it. I don't get hung up on that argument too much, but in the philosophical realm, I think you make some very valid points.
Well, and it goes well beyond the issues that we've talked about here. The fact is that our society, Western society, is established firmly on Judeo-Christian principles. Mm-hmm. And when we abandon those principles, we abandon wholesale, perhaps not so much the principles, but the philosophical premises that underpin those our behaviors and our standards of behavior, to the point where, science, quote unquote, rules all. And again, I'm not being unscientific here. I have no problems with science. I'm just pointing out that, there is a limit to what science can and cannot do, and what it can and cannot offer. Yeah. So many of the rules that we as a society historically have lived by are not things that can be scientifically proven. They're not very utilitarian, to use the proper word. Killing, protecting human life, particularly defending the life and of the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly, the sick, the young. Is there any human being more vulnerable than a preborn child at 8 months or 9 months or 7 months? The funny thing is that while I'm solidly pro-life, I'm not unsympathetic to the complexities of the argument about abortion on the so-called pro-choice side. Mm-hmm. I don't dismiss the validity and the concerns that are raised, but I do say this. I say that, at some point in time, the fact that there are questions and conflicts and complexities is not sufficient justification to throw out the rule book, because it's the rule book that makes us human. And there's no scientific basis for many of those rules. These are just the premises of our society that our society is based on. And if you abandon those things, you abandon those guideposts along the way. Now, just to finish the thought, a lot of this really stems from the abandonment of religious practice and belief and commitment to our Christian or our Judeo-Christian heritage in Western society these days. And here's the danger, Nick. The danger is that people today, younger people today, who are not well-versed or have no connection, or worse, are hostile to the religious, the theological foundations of much of these things, but they still talk about things like, proper behavior or good. So, for instance, the reason that we have assisted suicide in this country, in Canada, is because it's supposed to be a good thing. And, but the question is, what exactly is it that makes it good? So when you take God out of the equation, then it becomes a very strictly utilitarian argument. And now you're saying, well, we're acting good in the good towards the good because we're respecting the right of people. We don't want them to suffer, and we're respecting their right to make the choice to end their lives. On a very superficial level, that argument seems to make sense, but I would point out to you that that's a very, very short step away from saying, and this is what I think these cases that you cited at the beginning of the show touch on, it's a very short step between that and the argument that we should euthanize, that we should kill human beings who are suffering, who do not have the capacity to make or express those choices, because we want to do good and, as I say, end their suffering.
Well, here's the way that I'm looking at this now, because I we hear the old axiom over and over again. It's the beginning of the slippery slope. I think we've well passed that with this particular issue, with the idea that human life is disposable whenever somebody finds it inconvenient or uncomfortable. We've gone right from that into a complete free fall. And if we can't protect people at their most vulnerable, then we can't protect anybody. And it's about time that I think that Canadians had a long conversation about this and really think it through, because a democracy, whether we like it or not, is going to make a decision on it. And to have people shun the conversation because they find topics like this uncomfortable is not an adult way to go about having a conversation.
You hit the nail right on the head, especially when you're talking about democracy. If you want to maintain your democracy, then at some point in time you have to have those boundaries. And part of the democratic ideal is that there are limits to what you can democratically choose for society to do or not do. And, going back to the whole argument of utilitarianism, the most successful utilitarian society that's ever been constructed in human history thus far was National Socialist Germany, where, as you know, the Holocaust did not start in 1941 when they were marching Jews to the gas chambers in the big concentration camps. The Holocaust started in 1933 and 1934, right, when the medical profession in Germany had taken the position that it was proper to kill mentally deficient and physically handicapped patients, partly on the grounds that these people were a burden to society. They weren't able to contribute to society in a utilitarian way, which was true enough. But partly also because they wanted to end the suffering. So, it's just a very complicated argument, and we approach it with such childishness. I find, and we banter about terms like compassion and greater good, etc., without having any clear definitions of what those terms mean. And those terms have to have a certain amount of absoluteness, but we've completely abandoned that notion now, and it turns out that what is good is merely what the majority of people consider to be good. Or to quote John Stuart Mill, it's not even the majority, it's the whatever the will of the majority is really the will of that small segment of society that manages to make itself accepted as the majority.
Yeah, and I think it's also what we've washed away is this idea that there is something called eternal truth. Even the argument it's never okay to kill somebody in cold blood seems to be in trouble because too many people look at this and say, well, I just don't think it's right. Well, you know something? It doesn't matter if you don't think it's right. There is right and wrong, whether you think so or not. And I'm not suggesting that, my version of truth is better than yours, because truth doesn't care who believes in it. Truth is just truth. And if you accept it, fine. If you reject it, you do so at your peril. I'm talking with my co-host, Joseph Benamy, who's over in Austria. Put you on hold, and we'll come back right after this. Stick around, folks. We've got plenty more right ahead. All right, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. I'm Nick. He's Joseph. He's in Austria, enjoying a balmy Austria summer morning. Yeah, it's about 4 o'clock in the morning there, 3:30 or so. And we were talking about some pretty heavy stuff before the break. I think maybe we'll switch gears And Joseph, are you still with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can. Let's
Yeah. You got to kill that music.
Oh yeah. I thought it would kill itself. All right, hang on. We can do this. There we go. Music is killed. Now, one
That's
of
the... okay. You're doing good, Nick.
Yeah,
you're doing good.
I feel like a little boy.
I don't think that's grammatically correct. I think you're doing well.
Yeah, well, where I come from, you're doing good, son. You're doing good. Anyway, I feel like a kid trying to ride a tricycle with training wheels, or a bicycle with training wheels. Tricycles don't need training wheels. Anyway, I'm kind of torn about which one to take on next. Either the Saudi trade dispute, how do we get here, or one of the topics that makes my blood boil the most, and that is historical revisionism. Do you want to take down the statue of Sir John A. in Victoria? Which one do you want to tackle first?
Flip a coin. I mean, there's just no. It's pretty amazing some of the right. Silliness that goes on. I don't have to tell you, Nick. Let's talk about this Sir Johnny MacDonald statue in Victoria.
Sure.
I mean, what an asinine thing. And, it's not just in Victoria. I mean, this is a debate that's been going on. Interestingly enough, it's a very Canadian and American debate. I mean, you don't get this here in Europe where people are going, oh, we've got to tear down these statues because this person was bad or that person was bad 200 or 300 years ago. I mean, come on, guys. What are you going to do? You're going to punish Sir Johnny MacDonald, retroactively why? Because he was not pristine when it came to First Nations people. Okay, so it's an argument that I certainly don't support, but really, if you're really serious about this, don't give me this. We're going to get rid of this the statue. How about we're going to, all of us in the city of Victoria are going to abandon our houses. We're going to plow everything down, and we're going to leave this area geographically altogether. I mean, you're removing the statue, but the statue is not the crime. If indeed there was a crime here, the crime is the fact that you're occupying, quote unquote. And I don't support this, by the way. I'm just illustrating a point.
Right.
That if there's a crime here, if there is a crime, then the crime is that you are occupying land that did not belong to you. Now, you may not have been around 100 years ago or 200 years ago when this land was taken over. But if that's the problem, then don't waste your time on a statue of Sir Johnny MacDonald, for pity's sake. Move out and give the land back.
Well, here's the other thing.
That's not practical. It's not going to happen.
Of course not. And they know it. So I guess their argument is, well, the only thing we can do, and when you read the article, it's the mayor of the city who has a degree in Canadian history that she's embarrassed about. Well, then give it back. She's almost finished her PhD. Then don't finish it. If it's that embarrassing, leave the country. Because from my perspective, Canada has very little. I'm not saying there's nothing to be ashamed of in our past. There's not a country on the planet that is absolutely as pure as the wind-driven snow. But compared to other countries, we got nothing to be embarrassed about. But more than that, and to me, this is where it is ironic. You're taking down a statue of Sir John A. MacDonald. Who gave him the title of Sir? What was the monarch's name?
Oh,
was it
right,
not,
sure.
Was it not Victoria? What city are they talking about?
Victoria.
So if he's guilty,
Victoria. Well,
she was the reigning monarch at that time. Are you going to change the city's name? I mean,
it's just this. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is the kind of banal, absolutely empty-headed thinking. Look, if you're making a statement, okay. First of all, you're right. I don't agree. I don't agree with it either. I think, look, some of the stuff goes back hundreds of years. What I would like to see is the Native community draw a line in the sand that says, here's what we want for reparation. Give us this, and the sin is forgiven. Okay, whatever that is, whether it's money, whether you want a chunk of land back. I mean, the Northwest Territories got chopped in half in one of the biggest land settlements in Canadian history, and now it's its own territory called Nunavut. Was that not enough? How many times do we have to expiate the sin of what happened to these people since Christopher Columbus? Give me a number. Give me an amount. Tell me what size you want the check. Let us write it and be done with it, instead of being beaten over the head at every opportunity to destroy and disfigure the history that built this country.
Well, and nobody is suggesting whitewashing history here either, Nick, and I know you're not suggesting it, but let's be very explicit about it. Some of the things that were done in those years were not very pleasant.
No, that's true.
They were, certainly, we like to think that our society has become more sophisticated, and in many ways it has. But the fact is that some wrongs were done to Indigenous people here by settlers, and nobody's hiding that fact. So rather than getting rid of the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, and which essentially, is akin to just sweeping the historical wrongs that were committed under the carpet and saying, okay, well, they don't exist anymore, so there are no object lessons to learn here. Look, if the Canadian government acted badly or in bad faith at that time, then that's something that should be talked about, and you learn that lesson. And that is what history is all about. History is not about praising historical figures. There may be an element of praising historical figures, but from time to time, but it's about relating the history. And if the truth is historically that, Sir John A. Macdonald was did certain things or authorized or nodded certain things that were not very pleasant, or gave him his nod to certain things that were not very pleasant, well, then talk about them. Nobody's saying sweep history under the rug here. We're just saying, stop being childish about it.
Yes, I could. And you know what? It's also, what value is there in having a history if all you're going to do is revise it to suit modern political agendas? What can you learn from revised history? I would suggest to you that you can't learn anything because you've twisted it to meet somebody else's agenda. Taking down the statue of Lord Cornwallis in Halifax is another example. The whole argument there was, well, he authorized the scalping of natives. Yeah. If you find out the whole history, the natives were scalping other people. He was only doing what everybody else did at the time. You have to have historical context, and you don't know that if you write that out and paint one group the bad guy and the other guy the good guy without understanding what was going on at the time. And this is why this stuff drives me crazy.
Yeah, well, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Nick. It's we shouldn't be taking on. There shouldn't be any kind of historical revisionism. But I have to say this though, honestly, and I know you made a powerful argument in favor of some kind of land settlement or cash settlement, etc. But part of the problem here is that. And I know that I'm going to get into trouble when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Look, are we not all equal before the law? And I understand the historical differences, et cetera, but the fact is, I'm not guilty of doing anything to First Nations people. I wasn't born. Most of my family were not even here, had not even come over to this side of the Atlantic Ocean when these kinds of things were going on. And I don't believe that you have to correct historical wrongs by paying out money or having other things done in terms of land grants, et cetera, in order to for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who did something wrong, may or may not have done something wrong, to pay those people who are the descendants of the people who were the wronged. it's very complicated, and I'm not dismissing the complexity of the issue, because when it comes to First Nations, it's not just a question of were wrongs done. In some cases, there were wrongs that were committed. And in the case of First Nations, some of those had to do with violating treaties. Okay, so, there are arguments to be made for compensation, but I think we take it too far, and I think that we, again, way oversimplify the subjects, and because they're complicated and difficult, and that there was a lot of conflict involved, and not just emotional conflict. I mean, there are practical considerations as well. I was tongue-in-cheek saying, okay, well, how about abandoning the city of Victoria and plowing it under, and then, returning it to its natural, no inhabitants state, pre-white person settlement, and hand it over to whatever First Nation controlled that area at the time, which in itself is a complicated issue as well, because we don't have clear historical records in many of these cases. So I said that tongue-in-cheek, but,
Well, don't give them any ideas.
We don't do that. Well, we don't do that, of course, because it's a stupid thing to even suggest doing, okay? So what do? We go to the symbolic, and we give ourselves a pat on the back and go, aren't we nice people, and aren't we responsible and moral people? We're correcting this historical wrong by removing the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald. And I submit to you that that's just an asinine thing to say. It corrects no historical wrong, and what the net effect of that is that a generation of Canadians who otherwise might see a statue of Sir John A. and learn about him because he's relevant, because we see his statue, that history is going to be lost, including the history and narration of the wrongs that were allegedly perpetrated by this person. So again, it's so many of these decisions, Nick, are just so silly and childish.
To put it in a very simplistic term, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because while, yes, he may be guilty of some, I want to use the word heinous crime. And, when it comes to separating families and children and residential schools, yeah, those are heinous things that he did. But he also did a tremendous amount of good, building the CPR. He was one of the most important figures in the founding of this country, other than, say, James Wolfe. But all these people played a predominant role in making the country what it is today, and making it worth, the kind of effort that these people are putting it in to get their share of it. Because if this was just a frozen wasteland, well, who'd want it? So the whole point is that we have a scenario where now, where we and this isn't true of just of Sir John A. This is true of Cornwallis and even Tecumseh, William, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who fought with Brock during the War of 1812. He wasn't exactly what you would call, pure as the wind-driven snow either, but he was the right man at the right place, the right time, along with Brock, to help make sure Canada stayed the country that it stayed in the shape it was until it could finish gestation and become the country that it is today. He played a huge role in our history and should be honored for that role, even if he wasn't perfect. And I feel the same way about anybody who played that kind of a role in our history.
Sure, and you're making a good point, and let me expand on it a little bit. The white man, in historically speaking, for whatever crimes were committed against First Nations and injustices, to use that term, nobody wants to sweep those under the rug. But let's also recognize the fact that, Indigenous nations were not entirely 100% peace-loving, kumbaya nations either. They fought against one another historically well before the European settlement of North America, and continued to fight after that settlement started, both in terms of fighting wars amongst themselves and fighting or joining in and participating in some of the conflicts between the inhabitants from from a European background. So the point I'm making here is that, if you're going to establish the principle of redressing historical wrongs, well, then, it doesn't. The history doesn't stop at 1867 with Sir John A. Macdonald becoming the first Prime Minister of Canada and whatever he did during his time in office, or gave a nod to, or turned a blind eye to, which is probably a better way of describing it. So, how about going back to 1767? How about going back to 1467? How about going back to 1367, before there was any white settlement or European settlement in North America? What do we know about the historical wrongs that were perpetrated by certain First Nations then? So
well,
again,
the Algonquin versus the Huron, or not the Algonquin, the Iroquois versus the Huron,
which happened after the settlement. There were, in fact, I think you could make the argument that it was an attempted genocide.
Well, attempted? No, it was a very successful one, because guess who isn't around anymore? Because of that. But the point, and I don't want to go down the bad Indian road. I don't think that's fair.
No.
Natives.
No, I think you're right.
I was just going to say that natives are human beings, just like you and I are, and they have their faults and failings, just like you and I do. And from a human point of view, they're no different at all in that perspective. And you have good ones and you have bad ones, just like you do in any other culture. So to portray them as anything else is an injustice not only to them but to history in general.
Yes.
It's not often I get a one-word answer out of you. All right.
But isn't it a shame? Isn't it a shame, though, Nick, that we're talking this way? And I think it's very sensible talk. It's but we're worried. And I think legitimately so, that that people are going to listen to this and they're going to misrepresent what we say and misconstrue it, and before you know it, people are they're boycotting our show, or they're sending you hate mail or anything like that. And it's just where we've gotten to in society with the poor quality of thinking that goes into the positions that people take on issues these days. Is just, I think it's downright dangerous, and I really just don't know what to do about it sometimes.
Well, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Just keep hammering away. And, to become intimidated by that kind of stuff, I think, is a mistake. There is a certain price to pay to stand up to this politically correct tidal wave we're being bowled over with. And that is that, there's an old saying, the truth always wins in the end, because it doesn't care who believes it or not. It's always true. Just like the sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west, unless you're on Mars. That doesn't matter whether you like it or not. You can't change it or not, unless you want the world to spin the other way. Good luck getting that done. But, there's certain things you just can't deny. And the harder people try, the more absurd they become.
Well said.
All right. What I want to do now is let's see. Okay. Here's a topic I think we can take to the top of the hour. As you're aware, there's been the buck of beer. It's not a scandal. Although you listening to some people, you'd think that oh my God, this is on par with closing gas plants. But Rob Ford kept another promise. I keep calling him Rob. Doug Ford kept another promise as Premier of the province. He lowered the floor of the price of beer to $1. He didn't say you had to sell it at $1. He just said the least amount of money you can charge for a glass or a can of beer is a can of beer, I should say, a can or a bottle, is $1. Now, as a free market guy, my first reaction is the government has no business being in the free market and telling people what to retail a service or a product for. That's number one. But with the history and the way the reality of Canadian society is today, they play that role whether you and I like it or not. But you would think that the sky not only has fallen, but now the stars are falling in on top of that. Because, there's a lot of microbreweries out there that are screaming about it. Something, and other people saying we're using tax money to do this. No, we're not. All he did was say, we're just going to allow people, if they want to, the brewers, to sell beer at a bottle, at $1 a bottle. Now, how is it that people can look at that and say, oh, I don't like that? Have you ever heard of anything that absurd?
Yeah, the province's, the government's involvement in the selling of alcoholic beverages in my view, has always been problematic, and I think that I think everybody's wrong about this. I think that if you're going to allow beer to be sold, let it be sold in corner stores. Like Nick, you and I live and work close to the Quebec-Ontario border,
right?
And everybody knows that in Ottawa on the weekend, if the beer store is closed, or if it's closed because it's nighttime, it's closed, and you want to have beer, well, you just drive across the bridge to Gatineau or Elmer and go into your local corner store and pick up as much beer as you want. And the funny thing is that that's actually not legal. You're not really supposed to be transporting alcohol across the provincial boundaries, but that's a separate issue altogether. But it's just, again, it's such a non-issue. Look, it's a legal thing. Sell it. I believe it should be sold in retail stores and get the government out of the distribution and of it altogether. I don't get the tax argument. Well, maybe I do a little bit. The government derives a certain amount of tax revenue from sales of beer, and so I suppose that you could say that if you're lowering the retail price of beer, by definition, you're going to be reducing the net amount of tax, not as a percentage, but the dollars and cents of what's actually raised on that sale. Yeah, you could make that argument, but I can't think of a more specious argument to make in favor of maintaining overregulation and government oversight on certain things like this.
Well, the argument, first of all, that they're going to lose money because they're going to collect a tax on the sale no matter where it takes place, as long as it's in a legitimate business. We're not talking about bootleggers or anything, but basically because if the government imposes a tax, they don't care about anything but that tax and how it's collected. Now, sometimes they'll do, take the moral high ground, so to speak, like look at tobacco, which you got to go through to buy a deck of cigarettes. I don't like smoking. I don't smoke myself, not cigarettes. I'll occasionally have a bowl of pipe tobacco, but that's about it. But, the point I'm making is that what difference does it make where it's sold to the government? Because all they really care about is the tax generated by the sale of the alcohol. Now, if you lower the price, right, you're going to increase the volume. And then you'll make more money on taxes on a commodity. Like, what would you rather have? The tax, if beer was $10 a can, okay, for a 10-ounce can, $10 in tax plus whatever it costs. So let's say it costs you $15 to buy a can of beer, and 10 of it's tax. You're not going to sell nearly as much beer as if $1 of it's tax and $1 of it is what it costs to make the beer and distribute it. People are going to buy a lot more beer. It's the volume that they don't seem to understand.
Yeah, sure, and those are good points. But I from my perspective, what I would argue is that none of this really is very meaningful to me. Does society not have bigger fish to fry than this? And there are many angles to take on it, and I don't know really where I come out on it, except to say that I don't think that this deserves the kind of scrutiny and angst and hand-wringing across the spectrum, political and social spectrum, that it seems to have precipitated.
Well, there's no doubt about that.
Long live, but But the real question is, Nick, sorry to interrupt you, but the real question is a pint of beer really a pint? And can you refer to it as a pint, given the fact that we are Mexican?
Don't throw all of my traditions out. It's a pint of beer, and that's all there is to it. I don't care how big it is. Unless we get into quarts, then that's different.
Well, you can still get quarts. I've been to a few places where you can still get quarts. But you know what? If you want to get into tradition, Nick, really, we've got to get back into the stubby bottles.
Yeah, that's true. You know, that was, I'll tell just a quick story as we headed to the top of the hour for our top of the hour break. The very first time I ever had a bottle of beer, I was 14 years old. We had just put about 1,500 bales of hay away in a barn. It's June. It's 95 outside, and I was just dead tired. And my dad looked at me, and he popped the top off one of those Labatt's Blue stubby bottles. He handed it to me and said, "Here, you earned it." And I tilted that back, and I didn't quit till I hit the bottom. The best tasting drink I've ever consumed in my life. And I'm not a big Blue fan. As a matter of fact, I'm not all that crazy about beer in general. I like hard apple ciders better. But, boy, I'll never forget that taste. That was just unbelievable how good that was. And it might have had something to do with all the heat and all that stuff that we just spent all day working in. All right, with that said, Joseph, I'm going to... Go ahead.
I was going to say it might also have something to do with the fact that the alcohol went right to your head at 14 years old. But
yeah, well, I've never been one to be able to do well. Okay, I'll spare you the horror stories. Yes, you're probably right. All right, so
okay,
you stay there. We'll be right back with more with my co-host Joseph Benamy right after this. We're going to take a little break. If you need to go and grab a coffee or whatever it is, you go do that now because we'll be back in about 2-3 minutes. Everybody, welcome back. We're glad you're with us, staying with us, I mean. My co-host Joseph is over in Vienna, Austria, doing a tour of Europe, and we'll end up down in Israel in 2 weeks, right, Joseph?
Yes, next week.
Oh, it's next week.
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here for a few more days, and then on Sunday, I and my colleague are driving up to Frankfurt, and we are then flying to Israel. So we will be in Israel on Monday, and then back in North America after a week doing some meetings and different events there. So it's a long way. How does the song go? A long way to Tipperary. Well, it's a longer way to Ottawa right now from where I am.
Yeah, I suppose Tipperary would be closer to you than Ottawa is, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
It sure is.
2 weeks before you're back in studio.
Yes, but allegedly.
Okay, allegedly. All right. Well, let's dive into some more of this stuff because allegedly.
Our number to call is 844-415-2115 if you want to join in the conversation.
Yes, by all means. We are always open to outside interpretations of what it is we're rambling on about. So if you want to jump in on anything we've talked about this evening, or if you've got anything else you want to bring to the table, by all means, 844-415-2115. All right. Now, first of all, let's bring us up to speed on the situation in the part of Europe you just spent the last few days in. I think you said it was Poland, and now you're in Austria. You spent a night in Czechoslovakia. So you've hit, man. I suppose it's not hard to get around one country to another in Europe. Like here, you think going to 3 countries, man, Mexico, the United States, Canada is about it, and there's a lot of territory to cover. So what is the political situation on the ground where you are now in Austria?
Well, okay, so you've asked me a few questions there. Excuse me. Let me first of all start off by saying that driving around Europe, or to be very precise, countries that are within the European Union, all of the countries that we've been in on this particular trip are members of the European Union, and so there are virtually no border controls. Well, not virtually, there are no border controls when you cross from one country to the other. So when we flew in to Frankfurt about 10 days ago or thereabouts, and we went through customs and passport control there, and since, this is the fourth country that we've been to, and we have not, there hasn't even been, frankly, a sign on the road crossing from one country to the other. The only way we've known is because suddenly the place names on the signs beside the highway are in different languages. But what we've basically done to determine whether we've crossed the border is to look up on Google Maps while we're driving. It's really that simple. Getting into Eastern Europe, it's quite fascinating because it's very clear. I mean, the freeway system rivals, and in many respects is superior to the freeway system that we have in Canada and in the United States. In some places, it's just so much better. But once you get off the freeways, in what used to be Warsaw Pact countries, Eastern Bloc countries, you still see that there's a lot of disorganization, a lot of infrastructure lacking, et cetera. So it's quite clear that was very clear to us in Poland, and it's not so clear to us in Austria. But then Austria was not part of the Eastern Bloc. Czechoslovakia was. So the European Union has invested a lot of money in building, these massive infrastructure projects like freeways, et cetera. And there's clearly lots of money circulating around in these particular countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, or not Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. But there's clearly a long way to go as well, I would say. So that's sort of the general overview. With respect to the political situation, well, in Austria, there is now the new president of Austria, the Chancellor of Austria, Chancellor Kurz, I believe is, sorry, I pronounced it wrong, is in fact the head of a center-right party and the head of a center-right coalition. So, we've had some discussions and meetings here with people who were involved with helping him get elected and organizing the election campaign. And they've done a great job, and it'll be interesting to see what his impact is on the overall policy of the European Union as it goes into really some very interesting times with respect to trade, internal trade, dealing with the trade in the United States, where we'll trade with the United States. And then there's a whole question of sanctions between, with the Americans wanting to reimpose sanctions on Iran and the European Union being quite adamantly opposed to that. And there's just a lot of moving parts, Nick, and I'm not doing any kind of justice to it. And on top of that, the final thing, and you'll like this, I mean, it's hot here. It's been hot in North America. But to watch the news programs here talking about the heat, and there was a report that was released by a think tank over the last couple of days suggesting that the Earth was imminently going to reach a point where climate change would be irreversible and wide segments of the Earth were going to become uninhabitable. And, the television shows here, the news shows, et cetera, have been absolutely obsessed with this particular issue. And I'm surprised there isn't panic in the streets or anything like that. Of course, coming from Canada, we'd be happy to have some more of that global warming. And, if it means that we have to move a little bit further north, well, that's life. But it's funny when I hear these people talking about, oh, my goodness, there's going to be uninhabitable places on the earth. Well, of course, I don't buy into that whole theory, but, am I the only one that's made the notice that's noticed, Nick, that there are lots of uninhabitable places on this earth right now? And if a few places become less inhabitable, there will be many places like northern Canada, if, global warming really is for real, that all of a sudden will become habitable. So,
yeah, wouldn't it be wild if Greenland was actually green again?
Well, and which it was, 1,000 years ago.
That's my point.
We know this. So yeah.
What's funny is, okay,
we'll all be moving up to. We'll all be moving up to Tuktoyaktuk.
Oh, well, I don't know about that, but if you could put Greenland, when you compare it to the size of Europe, if you took the ice cap off it, there's a fair amount of real estate over there that nobody's presently. I mean, it's Danish territory, except for Hans Island, that's ours. But for the rest of it, okay, so move to Greenland. Yeah, it is a bit absurd.
Well, you have to ask yourself, okay, look, there is zero evidence. We keep coming back to this. Zero evidence to support the suggestion that climate change is being precipitated by human activity. There's just no evidence of that. Climate change is cyclical, as you know, and we're in a warmer period than we have been in the recent past. And maybe it'll get warmer. I don't know. I mean, the trends have not been. It's very easy to look at the situation today and say, oh, look, it's 35 degrees in Vienna. And, the average temperature last year was 34.3. I'm making those numbers up, by the way. So, this is evidence that the Earth is about to burn. It's just nonsense. But if this was a problem, then, invest some money in coping with climate change. I mean, that's really what you should be doing. In other words, okay, air conditioning. Can we have some more air conditioning here in Vienna? Please stop. Forget about, I don't care about the carbon dioxide concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, okay? I can deal with greenhouse gases if you give me a little air conditioning.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, Joseph, I'll go down into the basement at home, and I'll take a bucket with me, and I'll scoop up a bucket of air-conditioned air, and I'll send it to you.
Well, listen, Nick, this is just one of those things that was not on our list of topics. But here's the interesting thing. Okay, everybody's screaming bloody murder about climate change and the temperatures and the health and all. But Nick, tomorrow morning when you have some time, what you should do is you should contact City Hall of the City of Ottawa and find out where they're going to close the pools to all of those children who are on summer holidays, because they close the pools. I stand to be corrected, but I believe that this is going to be the last week that public pools are open in Ottawa. And so everybody wants to do something to help people deal with the higher temperatures this summer. But we're not going to leave those pools open for the kids who are on summer vacation.
Well,
spend some money hiring lifeguards for 2 more weeks until the kids go back to school. But no, we're going to lay those people off because we can't afford them. And one of the reasons we can't afford them is because we're spending money trying to stop the climate from changing. Our priorities are just so absurdly mixed up. One wonders if 100 years from now people are going to look back on this and think, was it just a comedy show, like just one long comedy show?
Yeah, well, they had a show that the title would certainly suit our current situation, and that was The Gong Show, because it's just absolutely, this stuff is so banal and just so, ridiculous on its face that you have to say to yourself, you're right. Historians are going to get quite a chuckle out of us. I mean, there's no excuse. Like if you look back, 5 or 10,000 years in human history, you can excuse a lot of stuff because they just didn't. It's not that they're not intelligent people. They just didn't have the wealth of knowledge at their fingertips the way that we do today. So we should be able to avoid a lot of these silly things, and yet we keep the more educated we become, the more simplistic and childlike we behave, and it's a trend that has always baffled me. One of the other things...
I don't know if I'd call it educated. I don't know if I'd call it educated. I'd call it maybe even more indoctrinated into what are essentially unscientific methods.
Yeah.
But anyway, look, we could flog this dead horse for the next 3 hours.
Yes,
and that would bring me to breakfast. By the way.
Well, there you go. Now, what's a traditional Austrian breakfast? Have you had one there yet?
Well, I don't know. I don't eat these traditional breakfasts. I have some dietary restrictions, so there's an awful lot of Wiener Schnitzel and pork and bacon and meat and all of those things. And
so I feel right at home there.
You would. Oh my goodness gracious, Nick! You would be right at home. A little bit of greasing the arteries there would be a good thing for you.
Well, you got to keep the pump lubricated somehow. All right.
Yeah, that's true.
On another note, I think it's time that we delved into this one. The Saudi trade dispute that's going on right now between Canada and the Kingdom of Saud. If you look at it very peripherally, or if you look at it just on the surface, it seems to have started with just a simple tweet from our glorious leader, Justin Trudeau, which, first of all, I never bought into the argument that the Saudis got their nose out of joint over just that tweet. There's always more to this story. Lay out for us how you think we got here, because I have my own opinions, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, great question, and this subject has come up in some of the informal discussions that we've been having here, and just amongst some of the delegates of this particular convention are not really delegates but participants, I should say. And to the degree that we have discussed it, I think we're all sort of scratching our heads because, as you say, first of all, in fairness to Justin Trudeau, I think it's important to remember that it wasn't actually the Trudeau account, the Prime Minister's account that the tweet was posted on. And I don't even think it was our foreign minister. I think it was just the general global affairs, foreign affairs Twitter account. So I'm not even sure that this was this tweet could have just been something by a mid to low range official at the Global Affairs Department. So, but wherever it originated, it was just a tweet. So to have the kind of almost ferocious reaction to it, where the Saudi government has, recalls its ambassador, kicks Canada's ambassador out, decides to terminate scholarships for Saudi students studying in Canadian universities, and now is going to be suspending airline flights between the two countries, I believe, starting on August the 13th. These are very significant actions on the part of the Saudi government, and it's left a few of us here scratching our heads, going, "What exactly is really going on?" Because it just seems to be such an overreaction to these tweets. So I'm with you, Nick. I think there's something else going on here that we don't know or yet, and maybe we'll never know. But it's hard for me to believe that all of this is happening simply because somebody at Global Affairs made a tweet suggesting that the Saudis should respect human rights.
Well, first of all, if I can just kind of jump in here, on one hand, because Trudeau has responded to saying Canada will stand up for human rights, and I find that laughable. First of all, he's distancing himself from the kingdom of Saud, which is, for all its warts and wrinkles, and there's plenty of warts and plenty of wrinkles, okay, is trying to reform itself. No society of that size that comes from that kind of a history can transform itself into a modern secular Western society overnight. It's going to take them decades if they can get it done at all, because of all, well, we're all aware of what the scenario is right now, with what's going on inside the kingdom. And they have a young crown prince who's doing his best to, do everything from give women the right to drive, which sounds kind of, bizarre to us because they've had that right over here for as long as we've had cars that I know of. So he's trying to reform things. He's pulled the teeth out of the religious police, and they don't have the same bite they used to. So he's making some strides. Now, when you distance yourself, what he's done seems to be that he's distanced himself from Saudi Arabia and snuggled up to who is Saudi Arabia's mortal enemy? Iran. He's making overtures to Iran, and they're saying, well, we love Iran, we want to have relations. So if you're Saudi Arabia, what goes through your mind? Now add to the mix the disaster that was India, the fact he went to China and that blew up in his face. On foreign relations, his government is an absolute unmitigated disaster. So if you're Saudi Arabia, maybe this is the straw, and I'm going to say this anyway, this is the straw that breaks the proverbial camel's back. Because they've said, look, we don't have time for this. We don't want any more of this nonsense. We're cutting ourselves off. The only thing they haven't done yet that they might do is cancel the LAV deal, which would really hurt Canadians, all because, in my opinion, this particular government hasn't got a clue about how to perform on the world stage.
Well, you could be 100% right. I'm just, again, I like to try to have as many of the facts as possible before I pass judgment, so to speak. But the fact here is that we just don't know, and I have a very, very strong suspicion that there is much more going on here behind the scenes than what we've been privy to in the public, and because kicking an ambassador out of a country is a major diplomatic action to take, and recalling your ambassador is that's not as severe. People do this, countries do this all the time on issues, but you ask your ambassador to come back for consultations. It's a way of demonstrating displeasure with something. But to actually order a country to not have an ambassador, to kick an ambassador out of a country, that's a big deal.
Yes,
and it's far beyond. And then the idea of canceling these scholarships, which will hurt some of these universities because Saudi students pay with the government support, the Saudi government support, very healthy foreign student tuition fees, far, far above what Canadian students pay for their tuition fees. So it'll hurt the universities financially, and maybe that's part of what they're trying to do. But again, the question is why. Now, having said that, the fact is that I'm trying to think of how to put this delicately, but we do know that a number of these students are involved in actively promoting, political and theological views that are perhaps problematic for Canadians. So, on balance, setting aside the trade issues that you've touched on, Nick, I would have to say that on balance, I think that this is probably better for Canada than. I don't think it hurts us that much, and in many ways, I think that you could make the argument that it actually benefits us.
Well, I think because we're coming up to the bottom of the hour, we're about to take a break. When we come back from this break, I think we should talk about the silver lining that exists in this. And I think there is one, and it may be a very significant one. There's still going to be a lot of pain, especially if they cancel the LAV deal, because that's where thousands of jobs in an area of the province of Ontario that they have been hurting since the downturn in the Canadian auto industry about 10 years ago now, when everything just seemed the wheels all came off, and they've been struggling to recover ever since. So to lose that contract for the LAV would be a huge price to pay. But there is a silver lining in this, at least as I see it. So we'll talk about that when we get back. I hope you guys will all stay there. Joseph, I'm hoping you'll stick around, and we'll be back with more on the Combat Zone right after this. All right. I just realized my mic wasn't on. All right. During the break, just leading into the break, Joseph and I were talking about the trade deal, or the not the trade deal, but the diplomatic war between Saudi Arabia and Canada. And the silver lining, as I see in it, knowing that there's going to be a lot of pain, is that this may be the catalyst to get our own oil to our own refineries, or to at least North American refineries, so we don't have to buy any more oil from the Middle East. We could almost become, if not completely, but pretty much, and when I say energy independent, I recognize that we'd have to either build more refineries or make access of mothballed refineries we have, or let the Americans do a lot of our refining and they just send it back to us as finished product. But that's a lot better than what we're doing now for at least the eastern half of the country, where we're bringing in Saudi oil at the tune of, I think it's 70 or 80,000 barrels a day that we're turning into gasoline and motor oil and those kinds of things. Am I being unrealistic in that thinking, Joseph?
Well, I don't know what the numbers are and the actual points of origin for oil that we're bringing in. So, but I think that energy independence, and there's a term that we haven't heard since before the last U.S. presidential election, and something that we virtually never talk about here in Canada is the idea of energy independence. That is, I think, a worthwhile goal that we should be striving to achieve. When you are dependent on energy, and we still have a fossil fuel economy and a carbon-based economy, that's not going to change overnight, if it changes at all. So, we're still going to burn oil, we're still going to burn gasoline in our cars, and we're still going to heat with natural gas during the winter times. So these are necessities, and to the degree that we don't produce them in sufficient quantities to be completely independent from foreign sources, it puts us to a certain degree at the mercy of these countries, so that's a sort of a long-winded way of saying, yeah, Nick, you're right. I think we should be doing more, and we should be striving for energy independence. I think that a country as vast and as resource-rich as our country is should be doing that, and we have so much that we could be exporting as well in terms of liquefied natural gas, there are global markets that we don't have access to because of our lack of infrastructure for moving oil and moving gas and refining it and then sending it overseas or sending it to foreign countries ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point. Like, let's face it, with all the oil that we have in North America and in Canada, and I have no doubt there's still plenty to discover, because every time you turn around, they're finding either that an oil field discovered is much larger than they thought it was, or discovering brand new oil that no one knew about before. And if you want, if with fracking joining the fray, you've got the Bakken oil field, which is massive and could supply Canada with its energy needs for, I think the number I saw was 250 years. So we've got plenty of oil in the ground, and we don't need to be importing it from
coal.
Coal, oh my God. You know, the height of hypocrisy is for Justin Trudeau to stand up and say, you know, we're going to do our bit for the environment if you believe the carbon dioxide rhetoric and no more coal nonsense. But he won't stop shipping coal from BC over to the Middle East to the Near Eastern, Far Eastern markets, you know, to China and places like that. So, you know, complete hypocrisy on that file. So it's always been amazing to me that he can stand there and say that.
And Nick, not all coal is the same. There are different grades and compositions of coal, and when people have heard the term clean coal, that's a real thing. That's not just a made-up term in order to alleviate or to reduce public concerns about the dirtiness of burning coal. And Canada is one of the largest depositories or repositories of clean coal on the planet. And in fact, you know, you can in some places in this country, coal to heat homes in more rural areas has been making a little bit of a comeback. You can actually buy coal-fired boilers now to heat your home or to heat your, if you happen to be heating your outbuildings, if you happen to be on a farm or whatever, at a fraction of the price that it costs for fuel oil, propane, or natural gas. And it's exceptionally clean, and the combustion technology, the boilers themselves are very efficient. So, you know, it's not like we haven't been doing things in order to help to protect the environment and to be more responsible in our fuel consumption. You know, it's straying a little bit off topic, but yeah, there's no reason, even if you take, you know, gas and oil out of the equation, there's just no reason for Canada to not be energy independent. There's no reason for it other than the fact that we don't have the will to develop our resources, and the regulations, unfortunately, that we have to live with are probably the chief impediment to actually moving forward on some of these files.
I couldn't agree with you more. Like if you look at Ontario as an example, we have plenty of coal in the province, and even if we don't, there's neighboring provinces that could get it here by rail, which is much safer than moving, crude oil by rail. If you're going to move any fossil fuel by rail, coal's the number one on your safety list, because if you have a derailing, if you lose some cars and jump the tracks and the cars flip over, they don't explode. They just the coal just kind of lays there until somebody comes and picks it up and puts it back in the box again. But you're quite right as well about the technology behind clean coal. It's not, we're not talking about the old days when ships used to have stokers down in the boiler rooms shoveling these massive chunks of coal in, shovelful at a time, and dirty smoke pouring out of the smokestack you could see for miles. Those days are long gone. Now they crush it, they turn it into almost like a liquid, and they burn it exceptionally clean. And there's two reasons for that, not just environmental. That's one reason. The other reason is it's much more efficient. You get much more of the coal's energy out of it, so it takes less to do the same job. It's a completely different way of looking at coal. And yet, when you talk about groups like the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, you look at all the watermelon groups out there. And by that, I mean red on the inside, green on the outside. They don't want to hear anything about coal at all. I remember I was when I was still on terrestrial radio, I got into it at the tail end of a lunch bunch once with Yasser Naqvi, and we started talking about clean coal. He said, "Oh, you just want kids to have asthma." I said, "Sure I do." No, that's nonsense. And I began to explain a little bit. Oh, well, I didn't realize that. This guy turned out, no, I didn't believe him then. I still, when I think back on the conversation, I don't believe him now. There's an agenda out there to keep coal out of the equation, because if you start using coal, then you really can't justify the high price of energy, because coal is so cheap by comparing it to anything other than hydroelectricity.
Yeah, well, you've taken the wind out of my sails there, Nick.
Well, I didn't want to. All right. Well, let's move on. I've got another.
Yeah, I don't know what. Okay, go ahead. Let's move on.
Okay, let's stay with the energy file for a minute, though, because there is,
sure.
according to CTV News, when was this put out? I'm just looking. I have the piece here, and I can't find the date on it. What? Oh, no, that's when the picture was taken. Okay, April 6th, 2017. The story is the cost to twin the Trans Mountain Pipeline could be $1.9 billion higher, according to Kinder Morgan. Well, who is surprised to hear this? I mean, we haven't even put a shovel in the ground, and they've already added $2 billion to the price tag. When you nationalize a piece of infrastructure like this, are we surprised when the price goes up?
Well, lots of things go into the prices going up and coming down. So, I'm going to sort of hedge my bets here and assume that it's not total incompetence, but we're talking 1.9 billion of what was the original price tag?
4.5 if my memory serves me right. Yeah, here it is.
So that's a pretty significant increase in the estimated cost of this project, if people should be scratching their heads going, and how does this happen? This is more than just the fact that the federal government is negotiating to take over the project. Kinder Morgan doesn't just say, oh, okay, well, now that there's public money involved in this, the price is going to go up by 30 or 40%. I don't know what's behind it, but it is very bizarre. And, this is coming from a strong free market supporter. Kinder Morgan should charge whatever they want to charge for all of this stuff, but I don't know. It's something doesn't smell quite right, and I'm not prepared to say at this stage that it's, completely attributable to the fact that the federal government is now taking over this project. I think that there's more to this than meets the eye as well.
Oh, it could be, but here's the first two paragraphs of the story, and I should have read them for you before I let you comment. Here they go. Out of Ottawa, Kinder Morgan Canada says expanding the Trans Mountain Pipeline could cost the federal government as much as $1.9 billion beyond the company's original construction estimate and take 12 months longer to finish. The figures are included in documents the company filed Tuesday with the United States Security and Exchange Commission related to its plan to sell the pipeline to the Canadian government for $4.5 billion. The original sales price does not include how much more Canadians will pay to finish twinning the pipeline between Alberta and BC. Finance Minister Bill Morneau won't say how much Ottawa expects to spend on construction because he fears that would affect negotiations with construction contractors, which are now underway. And here's the last paragraph I'll read to you. The $7.4 billion construction cost Kinder Morgan reported in February of 2017 hasn't been updated since the project hit political snags, construction delays, and opposition in BC. So that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what's going on. And you're right, there's a lot more to this than meets the eye, but I am not surprised that when you inject government into what should be a private sector project, the things are going to get more expensive. Maybe it's not nefarious. I'm not suggesting they're doing this just to drive the price up. I just think they don't know how to run a pipeline.
Yeah, but again, I agree with you, Nick. I don't think that the government should be involved in this. I don't think that government is any better at building pipelines than they are at running the auto industry, which they don't do. And, lo and behold, or even a better example somebody brought up recently that I was reading, how about the shoe industry? Like, isn't the shoe industry really efficiently run? I mean, people wear shoes. Everybody has shoes, multiples of shoes in Canada. We don't need the government to regulate and to organize and to own the shoe industry. We don't need the government to own the pipelines. We don't need the government to own hospitals and operate hospitals. These things can all operate, have some minimal, sensible regulations, and that's the end of it. So, yeah, we're all on the same page with all of this, Nick, but such a huge increase in the estimate so quickly after the government has become more formally involved in the project, I just don't think that there's been enough time to have the effect that, that I think we all would be concerned about, and that is that as soon as you have public dollars involved in this, tax dollars, that, the efficiencies and all that are going to disappear and the costs are going to rise exponentially. I don't think that that's the issue here. And I know, again, I can hear people complaining in the background going, well, that Benamy is defending the government again. And I hate the idea of being accused of defending the government, but, we have to be sensible also. We have to to ensure that we really understand what the problems are if we want to have some solutions. And in this case, something doesn't smell right.
Well, you're right about that. Something stinks in Denmark, that's for sure. Let's leave that.
And it ain't the cheese.
Yeah, are Danes really known for their cheese?
There you go. I probably shouldn't have said that. Now we're going to get complaints that we're anti-Danish.
No, I like my Danish.
And Nick?
Yeah.
That's what I was just going to say, Nick. I don't know about you, but I am definitely not anti-Danish.
Me neither. I think the Dutch are known for their cheese, along with their wooden heads, wooden shoes, and wooden listens. But, and I can say that from firsthand experience. The other thing I wanted to
Because you're Dutch.
Yeah, well, at least half Dutch. That's the wouldn't listen part. Anyway, I wanted to touch on one more topic here just to kind of round out the show. We're coming into municipal elections, and the one in Ottawa doesn't really have, because no serious contenders is challenging the mayor, there's not a lot of interest in municipal political races at the moment. There's some interesting side races. There's one ward's got 17 people running in it. Because I think the former councillor retired. I forget the circumstances, but there's a vacancy. So now 17 people all think they're the best person for the job. One of them is going to be right. But in general, when it comes to municipal elections, how important are they and how closely should people watch them?
Well, great subject, Nick, and because the truth is that insofar as your interaction with government, a private citizen's interaction with government is concerned, that more often happens at the municipal level. Yes, you're going to interact with your provincial government, and provincial laws and policies are going to impact you for sure. Same thing with the federal government. But the higher the level of government, the less direct impact that their policies and their activities have on your day-to-day life. So the most important level of government, insofar as individual interaction with government, is at the municipal level. The streets that you drive on, the police, the fire department, the local infrastructure, sewers, water supply, property taxes. The list goes on and on and on. Garbage collection.
Don't get me started about that.
People living there. So it's funny and odd when you think about it that. The further up the governmental chain, if you will, that you get, the more people pay attention to it. So voter turnout for a federal election is relatively high. Now it's gone down over recent years, from its higher point, but you're still looking at 60 to 70% voter turnout, 55, 60, 70% voter turnout. Generally speaking, you don't get that high in a provincial election, and for sure you don't get anywhere near that in a municipal election. Just to use Ottawa as an example, I believe, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe that the voter turnout in the last municipal election in Ottawa was for mayor was certainly below 40%. I want to say about 38%, but I stand to be corrected on that. So I find it's really quite bizarre when you think about it. And this is not just a Canadian thing. We see this pattern repeated over and over again throughout Western democracies. I don't know why it is. I don't really know that anyone studied the phenomenon to try to figure out why it is the way it is, but that is true. So, look, my recommendation is, if you're an engaged citizen, get fully engaged and involved in your municipal elections, because they really count. They really, really count.
Now, can you say the same thing about, let's say, school boards and the different trustee positions that people get elected to? Because I agree with you. I think that these are the ones that actually matter, because that's where the rubber hits the road. You mentioned garbage pickup. Well, I know in the city of Ottawa, it's every 2 weeks. Now, that might work in January when there's no flies and the garbage freezes out in the garage. But right now, after 2 weeks, the garbage starts to make the garage smell rather hummy. So, you can really appreciate what kind of an inconvenience that is. And yet, the level of government that deals with that is the one that people pay the least amount of attention to. So if that's true of municipal government, when you drop down another layer to, let's say, a school board trustee, I shudder to think of what the turnout is for those races.
Yeah, they're pretty low. But part of that is because, truth be known, while school board trustees do have a certain amount of power, they don't have as much oversight power as they used to traditionally. A number of the things that used to be under the purview of the local school board are now, in fact, controlled by the provincial government. So it's, the school board elections, while all elections are important. And, if you're an engaged citizen, as we all should be, then you should be getting out and making sure that you're informed about the issues and that you're exercising not your democratic right, but your democratic duty. So nobody should ignore school board elections either. But I'd be less than honest if I didn't say that the relevance of school board elections has dropped off considerably in recent years as well. But in terms of who you're electing for mayor, who are you electing for your local council, councillor on city council, these are extremely important elections, always, not just, the typical cliche that you hear, this is the most important election in our lifetime. Well, all elections are important, and especially municipal elections. So, if I'm recommending to people, I'm saying, get involved, or at a minimum, get informed and get out and vote.
Amen to that, because you're right. If you care about potholes, if you care about garbage pickup, if you care about drainage issues, the federales are not going to help you with those. If you, they're there for you if you need a passport or, some kind of. It's also fascinating, and I think if I could just thinking about this as we come towards the end of the show, I think one of the reasons, and I have no evidence to support this, it's just a gut feeling. One of the reasons why people don't pay attention to municipal elections is because in a lot of cases, not all by any stretch, but in a lot of cases, it takes too much effort. You actually have to get engaged and become your own search engine. the average counselor does not have the budget of somebody running for a federal riding for a major party. They're out there by themselves. They've got a small team of volunteers, so they don't get a chance to knock on nearly as many doors as, let's say, somebody running for, major party on a federal level. So it's not the same thing. The workload is tremendous. You still have the same amount of constituents for the most part, and those constituents, they'll listen if you find their door and their home because they're polite. People don't want to be rude, but they're not going to make the effort to go to a website, have a look, unless it's something that doesn't affect them where, they can do it and it's easy. But ask yourself this: if you're a new somebody who wants to be, you're Bob Smith from Smallville running in a small ward, do you have the money to put up a website, print out flyers, and hammer in signs? Where's your volunteers coming from? There's no way to create the buzz that it takes to get elected.
Well, that of course is a bigger question, a bigger topic. The question of how much money, in our rush to ensure that elections can't be bought by rich people, and I'm saying all of that tongue in cheek, we've really, I think, hurt the democratic process by imposing too many restrictions on donations, making them so small that we've essentially put candidates for political office into the position where they cannot afford to communicate and interact effectively with their constituents. And that's a pet peeve of mine. I'm all for donation limits, and I'm all for campaign spending limits, whether we're talking federal, provincial, or municipal. I'm just saying that whatever those limits are, they ought to be sensible. And right now, they are not sensible. And the trend is to make them even less sensible. So, amen to what you're saying there, brother. I mean, really. But having said all of that, Nick, look, in this day and age, you can get information. You can pick up the phone. You can call the city of Ottawa, and they're going to have contact information for all of the candidates, whether for mayor or for your local councillor. So there's really no excuse for not finding out and communicating and interacting with your candidates and making informed choices. What's lacking is the motivation to actually do that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't explain it. I don't know why it's so low at the municipal level for the reasons we've already discussed, but it is. And if I had any advice to give for people who were interested in politics, I'd say, get involved and engaged at the municipal level, because that's the area where your interaction with government is so great and so profound, much, much greater and more profound than at the provincial or federal level. And again, that's not just a Canada thing. It's not just an Ontario thing. That's all throughout Western society that,
Oh, listen.
There it is. I'm talking myself out.
No, guess what? You timed it perfectly, because that is 2 hours. Time sure flies when you're having fun. So I'm going to let you go, because you need to either go have breakfast or try to catch a little more sleep before you roll out of bed and carry on with your day. And I look forward to having you back. We'll do this again where are you going to be next week?
Interestingly enough, Nick, I'm going to be in Jerusalem next week. So heading to Israel on Monday, and we'll be back the week after and to our undisclosed bunker in Ottawa. But next week we'll be in Israel.
All right. Well, I look forward to talking to you again there. In the meantime, you have a safe trip home and enjoy your time overseas.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks to all our listeners out there, and have a great week.
All right. Thanks again. I join Joseph in saying that. It's been a great time. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I know I certainly did. 2 hours come and gone. It's been the Combat Zone. Thanks for joining us, folks, and we'll see you all again next time.